In the dead of night, on a deserted road known as Highway 666, a solitary trucker named Marco navigates his rig through the eerie shadows. His face etched with fear reflected in the headlights, he desperately tries to escape the clutches of the cursed highway. Each mile intensifies the sensation of a malevolent presence hovering over him, waiting to strike. Highway 666 is infamous for its legends of lost souls and supernatural encounters. But Marco doesn't believe in such tales, until his confidence is shattered by an abrupt noise coming from his truck's engine. The vehicle shakes, and in an instant, the driver finds himself stranded in the middle of nowhere, vulnerable to the surrounding darkness. Marco's heart races as he realizes he is completely alone, cut off from the outside world. With the darkness closing in around him, he knows his only chance for help is to walk to a nearby gas station. Cautiously, he steps out of the truck, feeling a chill run down his spine as his footsteps echo in the silent night. That's when he sees a figure strangely standing by the side of the road, immersed in the darkness as if it were part of it. A chilling sensation runs down Marco's spine, causing him to hesitate. An uncontrollable fear grips his chest, for something beyond human comprehension seems to inhabit that cursed place. Marco realizes with growing horror that he is not alone on this fateful night. He is powerless against the unknown threats lurking around him, waiting to reveal their nefarious intentions. Marco's fate now lies in the hands of the unknown, as the shadows of Highway 666 prepare to engulf him in a nightmare of terror and despair. Marco feels the icy chill intensify as the mysterious figure disappears before his eyes, leaving behind a trail of mystery and terror. The trucker hesitates for a moment, trying to ignore the feeling that something terrible is lurking in the shadows of the night. Determined to find help, Marco continues his solitary journey toward the distant gas station. Each step echoes like a drumbeat, a constant reminder of the dense darkness surrounding him. But as he advances, the trucker notices a change in the environment around him. The sounds of the night become sharper. The whispers of the wind seem to murmur indistinct words in his ears. The deserted road reveals dark secrets as Marco approaches an abandoned inn by the roadside. The place exudes an aura of desolation and neglect, shadows dancing around the broken windows like hungry specters. A chilling sensation washes over him, a premonition that something sinister awaits beyond the dusty doors of the inn. With a knot of apprehension in his throat, Marco steps into the inn's gloomy interior, the floorboards creaking under his feet like a silent warning. The faint light from flickering lanterns reveals scant details, leaving most of the place shrouded in twilight. But despite the darkness, something watches him, invisible eyes following him silently, feeding the latent fear growing in his chest. What awaits Marco inside the abandoned inn? Will he find help, or become just another victim of the supernatural forces haunting Highway 666? The trucker finds himself in a dangerous game with the unknown, where the line between reality and nightmare becomes increasingly blurred as horror unfolds before his eyes in a macabre dance of fear and suspense. Marco steps into the inn with hesitant steps, each movement echoing in an eerie silence. The darkness seems to close in around him, and he feels an almost tangible presence watching him. Trying to control his ragged breathing, he advances down the narrow hallway, covered in dust and cobwebs, his senses on high alert. Suddenly, a sharp noise breaks the deadly silence. Marco quickly turns, his eyes wide with fear fixed on a partially ajar door. A fragile beam of light escapes from the opening, as if something or someone is lurking on the other side. With trembling hands, he approaches the door. The creaking wood under pressure reveals its fragility, as if it had been neglected for decades. Hesitating for a moment, Marco gently pushes the door open, revealing the space beyond. The room is small and cluttered, filled with dusty old furniture and fallen objects. In the far corner, a flickering lantern dimly illuminates the figure of a woman. She looks pale and frail, her eyes fixed on Marco with an expression of despair and pleading. A chill runs down his spine as he realizes she is not actually there, but a shadow of the past, an echo of something terrible that happened long ago. Trying to stay calm, Marco approaches her, but the figure vanishes like smoke in the air, leaving only a sense of cold and desolation. The trucker feels panic growing in his chest, but knows he must continue. He is now aware that the inn holds macabre secrets and needs to find a way out before he becomes another lost soul on Highway 666. Suddenly, a harsh noise breaks the tension. Marco turns to see a figure emerging from the shadows, an insidious smile on its face. The eyes glowing in the twilight reveal an indescribable malevolence. Terror grips Marco, who realizes he is face to face with the evil forces haunting the fateful night. Marco's eyes widen, and his heart races, but he knows he cannot hesitate. Trying to find a shred of courage, he faces the sinister figure, which slowly advances towards him, each step resonating like a drum of doom. "Who are you?" Marco asks, his voice almost a whisper, choked with fear. The figure only laughs, a low, guttural laugh that reverberates through the inn's walls. "I'm just a shadow, a fragment of this cursed place. You've ventured too far, trucker." Marco feels the heavy air around him, as if the very atmosphere is impregnated with evil. The figure raises a hand, and Marco instinctively backs away, stumbling over an old chair and falling onto the dusty floor. "You have no escape. Highway 666 doesn't take prisoners, only distorted memories and lost souls." The figure's voice turns into a sinister whisper, and it begins to close in. Desperate, Marco tries to get up, but feels a powerful force holding him in place. Despair grips his mind as the figure crouches over him, its eyes glowing with insane malice. "Let me go," Marco shouts, but his voice is muffled by the inn's walls, as if the very space is conspiring against him. At that moment, an intense light bursts from nowhere, illuminating the entire room. The sinister figure recoils, screaming in pain, and Marco feels the pressure on him lessen. He takes the opportunity and gets up, running towards the light. The light envelops him, and Marco hears a familiar sound, his truck's engine roaring back to life. Suddenly, he is back on the road, the truck moving as if nothing had happened. Highway 666 stretches before him, and he drives as fast as he can, leaving the inn and its horrors behind. Marco never looks back again, but knows that somewhere in the darkness of the road, the shadows continue to wait. And with a final glance in the rearview mirror, he promises himself he will never return to that damned highway. The truck speeds down the road, the headlights slicing through the darkness like blades. Marco keeps his eyes fixed on the horizon, his heart still pounding in his chest. He knows he needs to get as far away as possible from that infernal place. A sense of relief slowly begins to settle, but Marco can't shake the feeling that something is still wrong. His fingers still tremble on the wheel, and the echo of the sinister figure's words resonates in his mind. Highway 666 doesn't take prisoners. Miles pass, and the landscape around him seems to change subtly. The trees become sparser, and Marco begins to see signs of civilization in the distance. A glimmer of hope arises when he spots the lights of a gas station. Determined to take a break and catch his breath, he slows down and parks near the fuel pumps. As Marco stepped out of the truck, the stillness of the night surrounded him. The place seemed deserted, with a faint country song barely audible, drifting from the convenience store at the gas station. Marco walked in, hoping to find someone who could help him forget the night of terror he had just endured. An old man stood behind the counter, leaning over a yellowed newspaper. He looked up as Marco approached, his eyes gleaming with a calm curiosity. "Can I help you, son?" the old man asked, his voice thick with the accent of someone who had lived his entire life in those parts. Marco hesitated for a moment before unburdening himself, sharing the details of his experience at the abandoned inn. The old man listened in silence, his face expressionless, until Marco finished his tale. "You found the inn, didn't you?" the old man said, his words heavy in the air. "Yes," Marco replied, "and I was confronted by something. I'm afraid it might still be after me." The old man let out a deep sigh and pulled out a small, weathered wooden box from beneath the counter. He opened it carefully, revealing a collection of ancient amulets and protective objects. Selecting a small silver talisman, he handed it to Marco. "This here should ward off the worst spirits of Route 666. Take it, no charge," the old man said, his voice laden with ancestral wisdom. "But remember, that road has claimed many souls. You'd better never go back." Marco accepted the talisman, feeling a comforting warmth emanating from it. With a nod of gratitude, he returned to his truck and attached the talisman to the rearview mirror. As he started the engine and pulled away from the gas station, a tenuous sense of safety began to take hold. Gradually, the ominous grip of Route 666 seemed to loosen over Marco. As the road stretched out before him, he felt, for the first time, that he might have outsmarted the dark fate that nearly consumed him. Yet, the promise to never return echoed in his mind, a constant reminder of the lurking terror. Marco drove in silence, the silver talisman dangling from the rearview mirror, reflecting the soft glow of the headlights as he cut through the darkness of the night. The road seemed calmer now, less threatening, but the tension in his muscles remained, a persistent reminder of what he had faced. Eventually, he spotted a roadside motel and decided it was time to stop, rest, and try to recover some sanity. The flickering neon sign reading "Vacancies" was an undeniable invitation for a moment's peace. He parked the truck in the small lot and got out, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders as he left the vehicle behind. The reception area was simple, almost welcoming, like an oasis in the surrounding darkness. A middle-aged woman with a friendly smile stood behind the counter. "Good evening. I need a room, please," Marco said, trying to mask the exhaustion in his voice. "Of course, sir. Room 12 is available. I hope you have a restful night," she responded, handing him the key. Marco thanked her and walked down the corridor to the designated room. Upon entering, he closed and carefully locked the door. The room was modest, but clean and functional. He collapsed onto the bed, his fatigue finally overwhelming him, and fell asleep almost instantly. In the middle of the night, Marco was awakened by a subtle sound. Something was wrong. The sensation of being watched returned, and as he opened his eyes, he saw the shadow of a figure in the corner of the room. Panic threatened to overtake him again, but the talisman glowed more intensely, as if sensing the danger. Marco stood up, keeping his eyes fixed on the shadow. "Who's there?" he asked, his voice steady despite the growing fear. The shadow didn't respond, but a sudden chill swept through the room, making him shiver. Remembering the old man's words at the gas station, Marco grasped the talisman and muttered a prayer, pleading for protection. To his surprise, the shadow began to retreat, its outline growing fainter. The talisman's glow intensified, and finally, the malevolent presence vanished as if it had never been there. Marco collapsed to his knees, clutching the talisman, relief flooding his being. He knew he wasn't entirely safe, but the protection of the sacred object gave him the strength to rise and continue his journey. From that moment, he decided to seek answers about the mysteries of Route 666 and the forces that dwelled there. He wouldn't be a victim, he would be someone who made a difference. With these thoughts, Marco returned to bed, placing the talisman carefully beside the pillow. And for the first time that night, he fell asleep unafraid, knowing the battle might not be over, but he was ready to face it head-on. Dawn found Marco awake, contemplating the first rays of sunlight filtering through the curtains. He got up, feeling more refreshed, yet resolved to understand what he was up against. After a quick shower and a light breakfast in the motel's reception area, he pocketed the talisman and headed back to his truck. Determined to find answers, Marco set out for a nearby village he had seen on the truck's dashboard map. The journey was peaceful, the landscape around him seeming less hostile in the daylight. Upon arrival, he parked the truck and walked to the small local bookstore, an old brick building with a sign that read Antiquarian and Rare Books. Inside, the comforting smell of old books greeted him. The owner, an elderly man with white hair and glasses, smiled curiously as Marco entered. "Good morning, young man. How can I assist you on your search?" asked the man, giving Marco a knowing look. "I hope you can. I'm looking for information about Route 666 and the supernatural events related to it," Marco replied, his voice filled with determination. The man raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "You're not the first to seek this information, but few return to tell the tale. Come, I have some books that might interest you." He led Marco to a section at the back of the shop, where dusty shelves were filled with old books and manuscripts. Selecting some of the most worn volumes, he placed them on a table. "Here is what I have on Route 666. Legends, accounts, and some studies done by those who dared to investigate further," explained the bookstore owner, as he ran his fingers over the book titles. Marco spent hours poring over the material, discovering disturbing references to disappearances, sightings of shadowy figures, and accounts of experiences similar to his own. One book in particular caught his eye, titled The Path of Shadows. In it, an ancient symbolist described how certain amulets could protect against evil spirits, mentioning the talisman Marco now carried. In one of the chapters, Marco found a purification ritual to permanently banish the spirits from the highway. The instructions were detailed and specific, requiring rare ingredients and precise execution under a full moon. Marco took careful notes, determined to follow every step. At the end of the day, Marco thanked the bookstore owner and bid him farewell. With a backpack full of borrowed books and a new purpose, he prepared for the next step in his journey. Route 666 might be a place of horror, but Marco now had the knowledge and determination to face it and try to bring peace not only to himself, but to all who, like him, had been affected by its dark mysteries. Guided by his newly discovered purpose, Marco felt more prepared for the challenges ahead. The road still held many secrets, but he was ready to explore them and finally confront the shadows that once nearly consumed him. Marco spends the following days searching for the necessary ingredients for the purification ritual. Each item seems harder to find than the last, but he remains persistent. He visits esoteric shops, flea markets, and even takes trips to neighboring villages. Each step brings him closer to his goal. Finally, the night of the full moon arrives. Marco knows he must return to the inn's location to perform the ritual. He drives back along Route 666, now aware of the danger, but armed with the knowledge he has acquired. The talisman beside him glows softly, a constant reminder of its protection. When he arrives, the bright moon illuminates the desolate landscape. Marco steps out of the truck, carrying a small cloth bag containing the ingredients and the book with the ritual instructions. He finds a suitable spot near the inn's ruins and begins to prepare the protection circle as described. Every movement is precise and calculated. Marco lays the ingredients on the ground, forms a circle of salt, and draws ancient symbols as instructed by the book. The wind whispers ominously, as if the very air is aware of the impending battle. Marco lights candles around the circle and starts chanting the purification prayer, his voice resonating in the silent night. As the arcane chants fill the air, the temperature seems to drop dramatically. Shadow after shadow begins to materialize around him, drawn to the magic he invokes. The talisman in his pocket starts to glow intensely, reacting to the dark presences. Marco keeps his focus, fervently reciting the words he learned. The shadows gain more defined shapes, their faces grotesque and distorted. They slowly move towards the circle, as if attracted by the purification energy. Suddenly, a blinding light emanates from the talisman, cutting through the closest shadows. They recoil, emitting screams of fury, but are unable to penetrate the protection circle Marco has created. He feels a surge of confidence and continues to chant, the power of his words filling every fiber of his being. The shadows attempt to advance again, but are repeatedly repelled by the light of the talisman and the circle's barriers. A familiar figure emerges from the shadows, the entity that terrorized him at the inn. Marco faces it directly, his heart racing but his determination unshaken. In a final effort, Marco intensifies his prayer, his words growing louder and stronger. The book instructs that at the ritual's climax, he must burn rue, a sacred herb. As he does, the talisman's light reaches an almost blinding brightness, and a wave of energy pulses through the air, shattering the shadows and the central entity. With a final scream, the entity and all the shadows dissolve, vanishing into the night air. Silence returns, and Marco drops to his knees, exhausted but triumphant. He feels an unprecedented peace on Route 666. The ritual worked. Marco stays on his knees for a few moments, absorbing the new sense of calm. He slowly rises, gathers his belongings, and heads back to the truck. As he returns to the road, the oppressive feeling has completely vanished. He knows he hasn't just survived, he has also helped bring a measure of peace to that place. As he drives, the full moon lights his way and the talisman glows softly. Marco smiles, knowing his journey is far from over. He continues forward, prepared for whatever challenge lies ahead, with the conviction that the shadows of Route 666 have finally been faced and conquered. Marco drives along the now pacified road, feeling lighter but aware that more mysteries are out there waiting to be solved. Route 666 may have been purified, but the world is vast and full of secrets. In a nearby small town, Marco notices a community bulletin board. One of the flyers catches his attention: mysterious disappearances in the dark forest. Anyone who can help, contact Mrs. Isadora. Determined to continue his path of helping and facing the unknown, he notes down the address and heads there. Arriving at Mrs. Isadora's house, an old, charming structure, Marco is greeted by the lady herself, a woman with gray hair and kind but worried eyes. After introducing themselves, Mrs. Isadora invites him in for a cup of tea. "Mr. Marco, we are desperate here in this town. Young people have started disappearing in the dark forest, and no one understands why. The local authorities look for natural explanations, but some of us believe there's more to it," Mrs. Isadora explains, handing him a scrapbook full of news clippings and photos of the missing. Marco flips through the scrapbook, noticing a disturbing similarity to the stories of Route 666. Decided to investigate, he accepts the task and heads to the forest at dawn the next day. The dark forest lives up to its name. Tall trees block out the sunlight, creating a gloomy and stifling atmosphere. The air is filled with the smell of damp earth and vegetation. Marco proceeds cautiously, trusting his talisman for any sign of danger. He brushes aside branches and avoids protruding roots as he follows the sparse trail left by previous adventurers. In the heart of the forest, Marco finds a small abandoned campsite. Signs of struggle are everywhere: torn tents, scattered utensils, and deep marks on the ground. He begins his investigation, looking for any clues about what happened. When he finds an old, partially buried and water-damaged diary, he opens it carefully. The diary pages tell a harrowing story: a group of young people who decided to camp in the forest for fun, but ended up encountering something far older and more malevolent. The last entry speaks of a cave that seemed to pulse with dark energy. Marco feels a chill reading those words, but decides he must check out the cave mentioned. Guided by the diary, he advances through an even denser, rougher trail until he finds the cave's opening, dark and menacing. With the talisman in one hand and a flashlight in the other, Marco enters. The cave is damp, with stalactites dripping cold water. He descends carefully, the flashlight's beam revealing bizarre rock formations and ancient cave paintings, possibly indicating old rituals. Inside, in a more open chamber, Marco finds what appears to be an ancient stone altar, covered with suspiciously familiar symbols. It's then that a chilling presence surrounds him. Shining the flashlight ahead, he sees shadows flickering on the walls, echoing the malevolence he faced before. Suddenly, the shadows materialize into spectral figures. Marco is surrounded by restless spirits, vaguely human, all fixating pleading looks on the altar. They seem trapped there, either guarding or being guarded by some unnatural force. Inspired by the previous ritual and sensing that this too is a necessary purification, Marco takes out the diary, looking for a spell or ritual that might help. He finds an incantation for soul liberation and starts chanting the sacred words, his voice echoing against the cave walls. A bright light emanates from the talisman as Marco recites his words with increasing intensity. The spectral figures begin to relax, their forms becoming less threatening and more relieved. The cave lightly trembles as if expelling the negative energy. With a final verse, a powerful beam of light radiates from the talisman, illuminating the entire cave. The spirits let out a final sigh of relief before vanishing, freed from their prison. The cave falls silent once more, profound and calm. Marco, exhausted, collapses to his knees, but with a sense of mission accomplished. He returns to the cave entrance, feeling significantly lighter. Stepping outside, he notices the clearing around is now illuminated by the morning sun, and the forest seems less menacing. Returning to the town, Marco informs Mrs. Isidora about the spirit's liberation. The news spreads quickly, and the town finally experiences real and palpable relief. More than thankful, Mrs. Isidora assures Marco that he will always have a home there. With that, Marco realizes his destiny might be to solve these mysteries. Armed with his talisman and the knowledge he continues to amass, he is ready to move forward, facing any darkness he encounters. After a few days of rest in the small town, basking in the gratitude of its inhabitants, Marco decides it's time to move on to the next mystery. He bids farewell to Mrs. Isidora and the people he met, promising to return someday. With the talisman softly glowing in his pocket and newfound determination, Marco starts his truck and heads to the next destination. He drives for several hours, following the map in search of other places marked by unexplained events. As the sun begins to set, Marco arrives in a seaside town called Old Port. The place is picturesque during the day, but as night falls, a sense of mystery hangs in the air. Decided to investigate, he stops at a local bar to gather some information. "What brings you to Old Port, friend?" asks the bartender as he draws a glass. "I heard this place has its own mysteries. Disappearances, sightings. I'm here to investigate," Marco responds, closely watching the bartender's reaction. "Well, you must be talking about the submerged cemetery," says the bartender, lowering his voice. "It's an old place over on the coast, which occasionally surfaces during the lowest tides. They say the dead don't rest there." Intrigued, Marco asks for more details and discovers that the submerged cemetery is an ancient shipwreck site. Old ships used to be brought there with the bodies of sailors who died at sea. Local legends speak of restless souls and powerful relics hidden among the wrecks. The next morning, Marco heads to the ruins of the Old Port, now almost entirely swallowed by the sea. The low tides reveal parts of old ships and makeshift graves. Equipped with his talisman and new determination, he begins to explore the coastline. The sound of the waves is soothing, but the feeling of being watched persists. When he reaches the heart of the cemetery, Marco begins to hear whispers. They are desperate murmurs in long-lost languages. Marco follows the sounds until he finds a rocky outcrop adorned with a symbol he vaguely recognizes, similar to those he studied in the village bookstore. Touching the symbol, a hidden passage opens in the rock, revealing a submerged chamber. He lights a torch and advances, the cold water lapping at his ankles. Inside the chamber, he is greeted by a haunting sight of old spectral sailors. Their forms are translucent, but their expressions of despair are undeniable. Marco understands that once again, he must be the agent of liberation. He consults his notes for a suitable ritual to free these souls from their endless torment. Finding an appropriate one, Marco begins chanting the ancient words, his voice gaining confidence as he progresses. The talisman in his pocket responds immediately, emitting a pulsating light that intensifies. The spirits around seem initially disturbed, but soon start to relax, their forms becoming less defined and more peaceful. At the ritual's peak, Marco asks for the sailors to find final rest and for the submerged chamber to be cleansed of its dark energy. A beam of light emerges from the talisman, illuminating the entire chamber. The spirits let out a final sigh of relief before disappearing, finally free. The chamber now seems almost ordinary, without the ethereal presence that once dominated it. Marco feels an immense peace take over the place. He turns to exit when something glistens at the chamber's far end. Intrigued, Marco approaches and finds an old gold medallion, adorned with inscriptions similar to his talisman. Lifting the medallion, he feels a protective energy emanating from it. Deciding it might be useful in his journey, Marco pockets the medallion, grateful for another victory against the forces of darkness. He returns to Old Port and shares his experience with the bartender and other curious locals. The entire town is filled with a new spirit, thanks and celebrations echoing in the air. Marco spends the night resting, but his mind is buzzing with thoughts of new adventures. The world is full of places like Old Port, each with its own dark mysteries needing to be confronted. With the talisman, medallion, and an unbreakable spirit, Marco knows his journey will continue. The path ahead is cloudy, but he is ready to walk it, facing every new darkness the world throws his way. Exciting journeys, mysteries unraveled, and unforgettable adventures await you. Subscribe to our channel now to follow Marco's fascinating stories and his battles against the forces of darkness. Don't miss a single episode full of magic, suspense, and surprises. Join us and embark on this incredible journey into the unknown.